and to all of you who've joined. I know it's a very difficult time that what we're going through, and we've had both in the professional aspect and in the career and family wise. Yes, I think we should bounce back stronger. And all these online meetings, there are plenty of them which are going on right now. And plenty of information, plenty of meetings. I know we're all really tired by listening to lectures. So when Nitya asked me, like probably a week ago, and I was wondering as to what topic, because it's very important that we have practical knowledge, because we have a lot of lectures, we have books, we have materials available nowadays, and it's up to us to actually correlate all together and put it in a nutshell from the experience, from the patient's point of view, what we've seen, and from the books and the theory based knowledge. So I think we as I'm audible, right? Can continue.
Yeah, ma'am, audible, ma'am. Continue, ma'am,
okay.
Please.
So I think as gynecologists, I'm pretty sure that most of them, around easily 60 to 70% of them would handle ultrasound invariably at some point of time. So I have each and every topic which I have taken this time for the next 45 minutes, 45 to 50 minutes is a topic by itself, where it can be spoken, each and every topic can be spoken for like hours together. So I have actually put across everything into a nutshell just to reiterate main points, and it's not going to be a lecture. It's going to be completely practical case-based discussion. So I would once again like to thank Forbes and Dr. Nitya for having me over, and without much delay, let's move on to gynec ultrasound made easy. So being a gynecologist myself, and after studying imaging, if you ask me, suddenly if I put across all these images to you, because patients come like this, so if they put across all the images to you without a report, so each and everything is different. We all know it's different, but I hope by the end of this lecture, the next half an hour, 45 minutes, I hope that all of us will be ready to differentiate all these all these 5 images. We're going to have the same set of images, the last, and I would have preferred it to be a one-on-one session, seeing the live audience. That's how we've been doing. We've been doing plenty of workshops and conferences, and that was a wonderful way of interacting. But nevertheless, we've been doing a couple of online sessions also, but the only thing I want you to evaluate yourself at the end of this lecture, knowing where we stand and did we even understand what these lesions are of. So we are going to go one by one. I have divided into different categories. So let's see how we can understand each and every image, and at the end of it, without any answers, if you are able to evaluate yourself by seeing these just static images and saying that probably that this is the diagnosis, then I think my day is made. So moving on with a lot of hope that I'll be able to clarify common questions to you and the myths in gynec practice related to pelvic imaging. So learning objectives, as I told you, it's going to be a systematic approach. It's the main thing all we are worried is not to miss a malignancy. So how to differentiate. Obviously, an ultrasound is not going to give you the 100% information like an histopath, but then how to, at least with ultrasonic features, how to differentiate a benign and a malignant lesion. It's very, very important after interpretation how you report those findings. I understand that there are plenty of doctors who have logged in, are a mixed group, plenty of them are gynecologists, many of them are practicing sonologists, radiologists, and fetal medicine consultants. So many of you would have already been going through plenty of these cases in day-to-day practice. And gynecologists who are dealing with regular patients every day in OPD. So first most important thing is pattern recognition, and the pattern recognition can be brought only by guidelines. It cannot be haywire. There has to be a guideline which is formed, a protocol based approach, unless and until we will not be able to identify what structure it is at one point of time. So apart from diagnosing, the next step goes to management and counseling, and also how do you counsel them for recurrence risk, or if so any. And as I said, that this is not going to be a didactic lecture. It's going to be case-based discussions. I'm going to talk. Yes, it's going to be a monologue, but I only wish that you could evaluate yourself at the end of the session when we go through the case-based discussions, as we are going to read these cases day by day.
Ma'am, at the end, anybody, ma'am, sorry to interrupt. If anybody is having question at the end, ma'am, probably we can allow them to talk, ma'am.
Yeah, I will finish in probably like 40 minutes so that we have 15 minutes for Q&A.
Yeah. I'll do that. I'll do that.
Yeah, definitely. So please type in your questions. Yes, I'll be more than happy to answer them at the end of it. So as I told you, it's going to be a structure-based talk. So we're going to have 5 sections. 1, we're going to have acute and chronic pelvic pain. 2, about uterine anomalies. 3, about IOTA. IOTA is nothing but IOTA and AITA are guidelines, International Ovarian Tumor Analysis Guidelines, and Endometrial Cavity Evaluation Tumor Analysis Guidelines. And the last one, we all encounter myometrial pathologies. So we are going to have case discussions based on these sections. So I've already given you a clue as to what section and what we're going to diagnose. So I don't think it's going to be very difficult for you. So first one, before going on to the case discussions, all I want you to understand is normal is always normal, and you need to understand normal first, and you need to see set of normal patients, at least minimum of 100 normal ultrasounds to even comment on whether it's normal or abnormal. As long as you can comment with a surety that this is a normal uterus and those are normal ovaries, I think you have learned almost 80% of it, because the rest 20% it's going to be pattern recognition, and definitely it's going to change from case to case. So you need to understand the normalcy first. Normalcy, yes, everyone, we are going to have the normal uterus most of the time. So the pattern of the bladder and the relationship of the fundus of the uterus along with the cervix and vagina is extremely important to comment on the position of the uterus, whether it's going to be anteverted or retroverted. 1. 2, the uterine measurements are to be done in a proper way so that the measurement is done properly. All the 3 measurements, the length, width, and the breadth is taken, and also the ovarian measurements. Moving on to the measurement category, let's see a broad overview. We all know about this. Abdominal scan is going to view, definitely you're going to get a broader picture, but the frequency is very less and the resolution is poor. You need to, obviously you need to make the patient fill their bladder. But in vaginal scan, you're going to go more closer to the structure, the uterus, the cervix, and the vagina, which you're giving. So you're going to have excellent resolution. You don't need a bladder filling at that point of time, but your area of viewing is going to be very limited. So that's the basic difference between transabdominal and transvaginal. And each one, both the abdominal view and the vaginal view, is complementary to one another. So it's not that when a patient comes for a transvaginal ultrasound, please screen them abdominally first, because you could miss a large mass or a large adnexal cell mass or a large fibroid if you're going to scan them just vaginally. So it's very, very important that you do an abdominal screening before you start a vaginal examination. And the measurements, yes, we all know all the 3 measurements, and the endometrial cavity measurement is to be taken from outer to outer margin. So when we talk about normal ovary size, yes, the ovary size, it ranges in along the reproductive age group for around 2 to 17 cubic millimeter or cubic mm. And the number of antral follicles, we are very aware that around 6 to 7 follicles in an ovary is quite common in a reproductive age group. And when the follicle counts goes more than 12 in number, or when the volume of the ovary is more than 10, along with irregular menstrual cycles and hyperandrogenism with higher BMI, it's very typical to put the patient into a diagnosis of polycystic ovarian syndrome. So now, this is all what I want you to know, at least have an idea before entering into the case-based discussions, because all of us deal with common cases every day, and these are going to be only common cases which we have seen so far in my years of experience. So the first, I'm going to throw case scenarios to you, and when I'm going to show the images, in case your screen is less, please zoom your images so that you can see them more clearly. So the first case scenario, we're going to go for the case series 1, where we're going to have acute pelvic pain and early pregnancy dilemmas. So in the case series, the first one, I'm going to throw 2 scenarios for you. One is a 20-year-old primigravida she has regular cycles. She has been recently, she confirmed her pregnancy, and she's around 5 weeks plus 3 days. She was not actually posted for scan now, but she was asked to come at around 7 weeks for a dating scan. But however, she had spotting since morning, and she had mild lower abdominal cramps for the past 2 days. So one, with the first patient, primary gravida 5-weeker with pregnancy positive with spotting and mild pain. Whereas when you go to the next case scenario, a 35-year-old with irregular periods, she's been having severe abdominal pain. And today, since her periods are irregular, probably around 35 to 45 days, she's 29-day cycle today from LMP. UPT was not done because she was in pain, so they referred her directly for scan. So now we are going to see the first patient. So the first patient who was UPT positive, and this is the first image after trans-abdominal scan. She was not, she was partly filled bladder, so the trans-abdominal scan was not that informative. So going into the trans-vaginal ultrasound, that was the uterus which was measured. What is strikingly over here, which obviously I'm going to answer that we'll not be able to have our talk in between. We will take the questions later. So there you can see behind the uterus in the pouch of Douglas, you can obviously see there is there's quite amount of fluid there. And when you can actually see here, the fluid is not only just plain fluid, it's not anechoic, but it is actually with lot of echogenic materials. So echogenic materials are really a concern for us, because echogenic materials, that means it's going to be hemorrhagic fluid. So we need to know, are we missing an ectopic pregnancy? That's the foremost thing what everyone are going to say, because she has regular periods and she is UPT positive with spotting. And what else do we look for? So what is the criteria over here that you look for before commenting that it is ectopic pregnancy? So it's very, as simple as it can be. An ectopic pregnancy, a sac should be delineated away from the ovary. That is the foremost point that I want you to remember. Even if you get an image from a radiologist or from a sonologist point of view, when you look into the images, you need to see the sac over here. If you are able to see my pointer over here, you can see a sac which is separately seen away from the ovary. So all what you have to do is, when there is an empty uterus, the cavity is empty, and then you have hemorrhagic contents in your pouch of Douglas, and you have a separate ovary, and the ovary marks is demarcated, but you have an echogenic limb, so you can reduce the PRF, and you can actually see nicely peripheral vascularity around this sac. And then she's only 5 weeks now, so you can't expect a fetal pole. So you can actually see a small hyperacute structure in the center, whereas the other end of the ovary is absolutely normal. So this is more or less a straightforward case that you can say that it's an ectopic pregnancy. Rupture, or it could also be a tubal abortion. These two, you remember when we saw that she had irregular periods, around 30-year-old woman, middle-aged woman with irregular periods, but she had very severe lower abdominal pain. UPT was not done for her. And what is the difference would you see? Even this patient, the trans-abdominal was not very informative, and she was in so much pain that she didn't even want to get down and go to the restroom. So you can actually see the uterus over here. Yeah, it looks pretty clean, so not much of any myometrial lesion over here. Can you see the pouch of Douglas? Even this patient had a lot of free fluid, but the difference between the free fluid from here and the free fluid over here, you can make a lot of difference, that this free fluid is anechoic, and it doesn't look as if it's blood clots or hemorrhagic. So the difference between the two, where you can see this ovary, the right ovary, perfectly fine, not an issue. Whereas you can see the left ovary, what you can appreciate over here is a lesion, which is almost like a cyst, probably a corpus luteal cyst. But how do I say whether this is a corpus luteal cyst? When I put a vascularity in this, there's going to be peripheral vascularity, which is so exactly going to be similar to that of my ectopic pregnancy, which I showed in the previous slide. So how am I going to make a difference between this, which is over here, this lesion, and the previous lesion, which I saw? Obviously, what I told you is that the difference between the two things is to trace the ovarian margin. If you can trace the margin of the ovaries along the ovary margin, the corpus luteal cyst is going to be inside the ovaries. And your ectopic pregnancy, the sac and the lesion with peripheral vascularity is going to be outside the ovaries, obviously in the tube. So that is the foremost, most important differences between an diagnosing an ectopic pregnancy and a corpus luteal cyst. Because Both of them are going to be complex mass. Both of them are going to have increased peripheral vascularity. You would be lucky if you can actually see a sac, a fetal pole, and a heartbeat, but not all the ectopics come in a way where you can diagnose easily. So the foremost important difference which I want you to understand is the difference between ectopic and corpus luteal cyst, where the corpus luteal cyst is going to be definitely within the ovarian margin, and the ectopic pregnancy, the ovary can be delineated separately, and the lesion is going to be outside the ovary. So these are the typical, the corpus luteal cyst can be in different ways. So it could also have something like a hemosiderin-laden particles like this, floating particles in the cyst, or it could be just be a collapsed follicle. So there are varying structural differences in corpus luteal cyst, which we're going to see in the few other cases in coming back. So those are the two cases where I wanted you to differentiate between an ectopic and corpus luteal cyst. This is the third case in the case series. I want you to see this the history very carefully. A 24-year-old unmarried girl came along with her mother with severe lower abdominal pain. And obviously they didn't disclose, she didn't disclose obviously in front of the mother that she was sexually active. Her periods were regular. Obviously none of us, at least right now, yes, or most of us are asking for UPT, but then she was only 18 days since LMP. So there's no way that we are going to even worry about her pregnancy. And she also had a proper bleeding in her cycle for almost 3 to 4 days. So she came with severe abdominal pain, and when I did TA, it was hardly informative. So the trans-abdominal scan, and then I said, even though you fill your bladder, it's not very informative. I can see only the uterus properly. But then I need to definitely do, probably we need to do an intravaginal, but then since you're unmarried, we'll not be able to, obviously. That's when the history of sexually active came. And then I asked her to use the restroom, and we did a transvaginal ultrasound. Then you can actually see the uterus is perfectly normal. There's an echogenic endometrium, which is similar to that of the secretory part on the second phase of the menstrual cycle. But why acute pelvic pain? Her ovaries, you can all actually see, I could demarcate the ovarian lines. This is only one part of the ovary. The right ovary over here was actually enlarged. This is the entire position of the right ovary. You can see plenty of free fluid, moderate amount of free fluid just behind the right ovary. And actually when you switch on the color, the entire thing, this is the left ovary on the other end, you actually see the entire thing, lesion, is the right ovary. And the follicles have been pushed aside, and the normal portion of the right ovary is behind this lesion. So then how do I report such cases? Acute pain, regular periods, 18th day, enlarged ovary on one lesion, one side, and the normal ovary on the other side. Obviously, you're going to think about a torsion, because the torsion, the diagnosis can be made with an echogenic stroma and the peripherally pushed follicles because of the edema and the secondary to congestion. So the diagnosis, the report how we gave was it is enlarged right ovary with collapsed cyst and peripherally pushed follicles. Probably it could have been an hemorrhagic cyst with torsion. Yes, the laparoscopy was done right away within like two hours or so from my clinic, and they did confirm torsion. It was twisted twice, and then they twisted it. They were able to save the ovary. So the most important sign is the whirlpool sign, where you can actually see that the vascular pedicles are twisting, and along with the echogenic stroma in the center and the peripheral follicles which are pushed. So they're very, very significant of an ovarian torsion. And actually recently, last week, I came across one of this paper. I think it's going to be published very soon in Ultrasound of OBGYN. It's a flipped ovarian syndrome sign, which I want to tell you that when there are mild patients, so they're not in severe pain, but they have a vague abdominal pain, and you're able to see an ovary like this. Those patients in UK, where they have done the study, those patients were screened in the ER, in the emergency department, and the scan was recorded, and they gave them painkiller analgesics. There was no free fluid. They're okay after the painkiller. And 1 or 2 days back later, when they came and with severe abdominal pain, this ovary, the cyst or the follicle, the dominant follicle or the corpus luteus, whichever you've seen on this side, actually reversed onto the opposite side. That means that the ovary has twisted, and that's what they called is a flipped ovarian sign, and they have documented in confirming with the laparotomy or laparoscopic findings subsequently for those patients. So it has a very good sensitivity factor, and this is going to be published very soon. So there are two signs which are correlating, one with the vascularity and the other one with the structure, the position of the ovarian cyst or the follicle, dominant follicle or the ovarian cyst, or even the ovary twisting by itself. And that's how they were able to identify that this follicle, which was on the other side, which was pointing on the right side, actually turned to the opposite direction 2 days later when she came with severe pain, that denoting that the ovary would have twisted. So the case series part 1, the learning points are: the key to the diagnosis of ectopic pregnancy should be a complex lesion with increased peripheral vascularity away from the ovary. So you should be able to demarcate the ovaries. If you have free fluid, that's because it could have ruptured or it could have gone into tubal abortion. Or if you have to differentiate between a corpus luteal cyst will have the similar findings also with the peripheral vascularity, but the corpus luteal cyst is definitely going to be within your ovary margin. So search for the ovarian margin. See if you can find a sac, a yolk sac, or a fetal pole inside it. See for the vascularity and look for the free fluid. And remember, corpus luteal cysts have varying appearances, which I'm going to discuss later on. So the case series part 1, that's what I wanted to give you as a key note. So the second part, case series, yeah, I think we have time. So second series, what we need to know is uterine anomalies. The next most common thing what we come across during a gynec practice is when we deal with primary infertility patients or even secondary infertility patients with uterine anomalies. Uterine anomalies per se has plenty of definitions: Escher classification, American Reproductive Society classifications, but then overall ASRM classification, everything talks about uterine anomalies which can be treated and which is easable to treat, so that you could give them a better benefit of pregnancy outcome. So I want to make it simple, because the classification per se, which I'm going to show you, that there are 3 classifications where all what it actually means is that we need to definitely make sure that the classification what we see, we can translate into the practical aspects of it. So the practical aspects, what I mean is noting the fundal indentation. I'm going to explain to you with a case discussion. Why I put these points across is that the main reason why I put these points across is mainly because that the uterine wall thickness was not included in the Escher classification. So they did have a plus or minus pros and cons with all the 3 classifications. But the main point what you need to know is the fundal indentation and the cavity indentation, because only those 2 points are going to tell us whether it's going to be a septate uterus or a biconvate uterus. So when we talk about case scenarios over here, I'm going to leave you with 2 case scenarios. One, first case scenario, what we're going to see here is a 25-year-old third gravida who has regular cycles, previous 2 early miscarriages. She came for a regular pelvic ultrasound because she's had a couple of miscarriages, and all the time she had scans only during the miscarriage time and post MTP or DNC. So that when compared to another woman who was 34-year-old, irregular periods, she's been planning for pregnancy since 8 to 9 years of marriage. HST done outside showed a suspicion of an uterine anomaly, and she was referred for a pelvic 3D ultrasound. So when we talk about the first case scenario, remember that this patient has had a couple of miscarriages, and this patient, when she's had a couple of miscarriages, this was the trans-abdominal and the trans-vaginal ultrasound images. Just give me a minute. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry for the disturbance. So the first scenario which I said was the woman who had previous 2 miscarriages. Here you can actually see the first image over here. It's a trans-abdominal image. This was a trans-abdominal image, and this is the corresponding trans-vaginal image. So what I want you to notice here is the cavity. Before going to the cavity, I want you to see the fundus. Can you see the fundus, the lining which I can point here in the mouse? Can you see the lining over here? That is the fundal lining. And the cavity, definitely, yes, the cavity is separated into two. So we all know there are two different cavities, but the diagnosis, what is going to help us clinch whether it's going to be a septate uterus or a biconate uterus, is nothing other than the fundal indentation. Definitely, the fundal indentation is very minimal. If you can see, the distance between these two are the interosteal or the intercornual line drawn, and this is the fundus. So the distance between the fundus and the line which is drawn over here is less than around 1 to 1.5 centimeters. So giving us the diagnosis or the probability of a complete uterine septum. Whereas the second case, you remember, where she was married since 9 years old, and 9 years, married since 9 years, she was trying to conceive, and a case of primary infertility. Can you see the striking difference between the previous case and this case, where you know for sure, yes, even this, here even we have two separate cavities, no doubt, but can we see the fundal indentation here? A complete fundal indentation separating the true uterus as two leaves, as two horns. So this is very typical of a biconate uterus, where you have a fundal indentation. Can you see the the line over here, where my pointer is marking over here? You can actually see a separate horn over here, and the right horn over here, the left horn over here, and you can also see a single cervix. So actually a 3D rendering of this here, over here, when you put the thing, you can see here there are two separate cavities. The fundal indentation is deep inside, separating the two cavities and connecting with the single cervix. So it's extremely important that we know whether it is a septate uterus, a complete or a partial septate, or a biconate uterus, because we are going to pose them for a septal dissection, and they would definitely have good prognosis after that. So how to report such cases? Basically, the reporting format should be two separate cavities, increased transverse diameter of the uterus. You can see two separate cavities with minimal fundation that points towards a septate uterus. You have two separate cavities with fundal indentation more than 1.5 centimeter or more than the uterine wall thickness, as in this case, with two horns, two cavities communicating with a single cervix, is more in favor of a biconate uterus. But is it so easy always? Is it so easy that we come across patients this clearly? Does the image appear so clear in ultrasound? We do have our own difficulties while imaging uterus, and that too specifically differentiating between a septate and biconate. Can you see here? This is that in between when you can't completely tell this as a septate uterus, and you can't call this as a biconate. Also, this is a trans abdominal image where you can see, yes, there is a dip. Not saying no, not denying it. There is a dip in the fundus, and you can definitely see a transvaginal ultrasound where you have two cavities separately and a dip. But this dip is not as significant as that of your previous fundal indentation where you had in this biconate uterus. And this dip probably is little significant more than that of the septate uterus. So what we did was we actually gave a differential diagnosis, calling that this probably could be a septate uterus, a complete septate uterus, but with minimal fundal indentation. So suggested with the Hystrolab finding, and to our knowledge, it came as a septate uterus. So you could have no or minimal fundal indentation in a septate uterus too. You need to have a higher degree of fundal indentation. The cavity should be separate. They should fall apart for a biconate uterus. So only then you call it as a biconate when you have no or very minimal in fundal indentation of less than 1.5 centimeter. Then you could still take it as a septate uterus rather than a biconate uterus. And it's extremely important that you screen the kidneys, maternal kidneys, when you do a pelvic ultrasound, because you could identify a solitary or a horseshoe-shaped kidney when you identify uterine anomalies. So the most important factor, yes, measurements are very important. I'm not saying no, but at one go, when as gynecologist, the next time when you go to OP and when you find a radiology report with a 3D ultrasound, and when you look at it, at least it should come that, okay, we are seeing the fundus. The fundus is not indented that much, or probably very minimal, but there is two different separate cavities with no minimal fundation. So the most probably we are dealing with a complete or a partial septate uterus, where if you can see a good fundal indentation indenting fundus along with an indenting cavity, then with two separate wide apart, then you can definitely call it as a biconvate uterus. And more important, so because why we need to know the difference is we are going to counsel them, one, for septal resection if in case of complete septum, and also if in case of a biconvate uterus, you're going to tell them about the bad obstetric outcome, what you can do, not to scare them though. We've had successful pregnancies even in implanted in right horn, in one horn of the uterus, but then to make sure that they don't end up with a preterm or miscarriages or any malpresentations. So it's extremely important to know the difference between the most common uterine anomalies. Arcuate uterus nowadays are not being reported because it's not considered as an uterine anomaly. So even if you see any reports reported as arcuate uterus, don't worry. And the pregnancy, we've had plenty of arcuate, normal, mild fundal indentation uterus with cavity normal being absolutely normal. So I think the case 2 series, what I wanted to make sure that the take home would be is mainly look for the fundal indentation along with cavity indentation. That is the most important take home point which I wanted to tell you. So yeah, we are moving on to the third case series where we are going to talk a little bit more about ovarian cyst. I think this part is the longer part, and because ovarian cyst is much more common than uterine anomalies, and so we are going to talk more about ovarian cyst and the different types of cyst which we come across in day-to-day practice. Again, I have put forward 2 scenarios for you. One, previous LSCS, she's had a one live child, LSCS 29-year-old. She has regular cycles. She's not contemplating on another child soon, but she has severe dysmenorrhea. Over the past 2 to 3 months, it's increased. And when she came to us, it was day 10 of her cycle. We have on a contest, we have another 32-year-old. She's completed her family, sterilized. She has on and off vague lower abdominal pain, but for the past 2 to 3 weeks, it's been increased. So the difference between the two is what you're going to see in the ultrasound now. So first, we're going to see the mother, or not a mother, who's had a single child with severe dysmenorrhea on day 10 of her cycle. This is the uterus. This is the uterus. It's an LSCS add-on, and she came with day 10. So the most striking feature of this cyst, what I want you to see and remember and take it to your mind, is that there are pattern recognitions in gynec ultrasound. And if you can remember those pattern recognitions and correlate with the clinical history, nothing like it. I think it becomes very simple to diagnose and treat them and manage them. So the uterus was perfectly fine. There was no reason or any myometrial pathology for dysmenorrhea, wherein I was able to see a thick-walled, how I would report is a thick-walled, unilocular, it is only one cyst, a thick-walled cyst with low level or ground glass. Ground glass is all over the place. It's almost the same echogenicity with minimal peripheral vascularity. Whereas the other end, the ovary was okay, but then you were able to see some linear hyperechoic lesion behind the ovary. So this is a very typical pattern of how an endometriotic or a chocolate cyst would appear on an ultrasound, and probably that would have been the reason for her dysmenorrhea. So she had an endometriotic cyst. She also had a mild left-sided hydrosalpinx. And what I also want you to know is when you do a transvaginal ultrasound, mainly you can do what is called as a sliding sign. Sliding sign is nothing but when you insert the transvaginal ultrasound, go and hit the uterus, slightly withdraw the ultrasound and rock it gently so that it doesn't hurt them. It's extremely important that they don't perceive pain. And when that time, you can actually see that the uterus and the adnexa are splitting apart in a normal way. That means the slide sign is normal. But when slide sign is positive, that means that the ovaries are stuck. They're like the kissing ovaries in endometriosis or grade 3, grade 4 endometriosis, that they do not move that freely when you withdraw the probe and then reinsert slowly. So most probably this is going to be endometriotic cyst. But then the other patient, if you remember, I told you she completed her family around mid-30s and she had vague abdominal pain, but it's been increased for the past 2 to 3 weeks. want you to know the difference between that cyst which you had seen earlier in the previous slide, which was a ground glass appearance over here, that is the uniform appearance, and to the cyst which you see now. This cyst is almost close to a low level internal echoes, but you can actually see thin bands of strands inside the cyst. So the vascularity is not that much. So another patient, a 30-year-old post-MTP, very, very similar to this sterilized 30-year-old who came to us, had a very similar finding over here. The ovaries were normal. The other ovary showed low-level internal echoes with thin branch. So what do you think that this kind of cyst could be? Obviously, the report should be probably the diagnosis of a hemorrhagic or a corpus luteal cyst. So how do we report such cases? You report them by saying it's a thin wall cyst, not very thick, probably with cobweb-like patterns, low-level internal echoes, hemorrhagic contents, and with minimal vascularity. So probably the diagnosis for the dysmenorrhea or low abdominal pain could be a hemorrhagic corpus luteal cyst. So the differences between an endometriotic cyst and a hemorrhagic or a corpus luteal cyst in an ultrasound, if you see overall ground glass appearance is endometriosis most of the time, and you have a low level internal echoes with fibrin bands like structures, you could possibly think of a hemorrhagic corpus luteal cyst. But always life doesn't put you across it very easily, right? So patient who walked into us, probably a 25-year-old girl, I think probably close to like March or April this year we saw, she came with lower abdominal pain since morning. Her cycles were irregular, so she just walked in with pain and no pregnancy test, no beta HCG, nothing at all. And then when she walked in, all what we could see is she was not ready for a trans-abdominal because she was in a lot of pain, so she didn't want a trans-abdominal. She said, "Doctor, I'm not able to perceive this pain." So we did a trans-vaginal ultrasound. Uterus was enlarged. Yes, the endometrial cavity was thickened, no doubt. The cavity was thickened, but you can also see the right ovary separately. You can actually see over here a small adnexal lesion. Unless and until you zoom the area of interest, it's close to impossible to identify, even differentiate what the contents are inside the lesion. So even a cobweb pattern could appear so close to that of an ectopic pregnancy. Yes, this is an ectopic, viable, unruptured ectopic pregnancy. You can actually go so close into this, zoom the picture and see whether it could easily be mistaken like a cobweb pattern. Unless and until you put a color Doppler, you actually see there is a fetal pole, there was a yolk sac, there's a large yolk sac over here. The sac is smaller, increased peripheral vascularity, and you can actually see the cardiac activity over here as well. So yes, surprises are always there. You have to be very careful. We do not want to overdiagnose or even underdiagnose anything. So always remember, pregnancy is always a possibility. Screen the adnexa, separate the ovaries and the adnexal lesion. Over here, if you can easily see, this is the right ovary. There's this much of distance between the adnexal mass and the right ovary. And actually zoom in this adnexal mass per se, you can see the cardiac activity also in that. So she did undergo a laparoscopy, and there was a salpingectomy done. Okay, so I was telling you this, right? There were different appearances of corpus luteal cyst. If time permits, please do go, if you can look into ISHWAG basic curriculum for pelvic ultrasound. It has excellent data on normal ultrasound and abnormal ultrasound in pelvis. So these are the varying patterns of corpus luteal cyst. So it could happen anyway. This is what we saw in the previous two cases. It will also be a cobweb pattern this way, echogenic lesion like this, or it can with sheets or bands of echogenic lesions. So a corpus luteal cyst can appear in different ways in pregnancy, or even when the patient is not pregnant as well. So you need to understand that the normal can also have different appearances. This patient, another ovarian cystic lesion, what I want you to see is a middle-aged woman. She has 2 live children. Her main complaint was heavy menstrual period. She had menorrhagia, nothing else, only menorrhagia, no dysmenorrhea. So her uterus was almost okay. There wasn't anything significant in the myometria. When you go on to the lesion, what do you think this lesion could be? And I could actually see the other ovary separately. But there's a striking lesion on the right side, where I can't plot it as an endometriotic lesion. I can't name it as a hemorrhagic cyst, corpus luteal cyst, nothing. But then this lesion is so big, it's not very small also, and it's minimal, normal right ovary on the side of the lesion. So very similarly, another patient post MTP who came just to see if there are any retained products also had this type of lesion on the right ovary. There's a thick wire lesion. The particles are not moving much. One more thing which you can see is if the particles inside the cyst are moving. The particles inside the cyst are not moving, and this lesion also very close in contact to that of the other lesion with mixed echogenicity. What do you think that we should report in these two cases? The report was complex, right? Because why I'm giving the reports which we have made is that when we report this way, it's easier to understand both for the gynecologist point of view and also for the radiologist point of view or the sonologist, so they can understand the reporting and the cystic lesion much easier before they take up the patient for laparoscopy or laparotomy. So it's a complex right adnexal mass, yes, with alternating hypoechoic and echogenic specks of calcification. But there was absolutely no vascularity on color Doppler. Probably it could be a dermoid cyst. And yes, it was proven with teeth and hair and as dermoid cyst. So now I hope, I presume, that all of you could evaluate yourself as to tell me which cyst that we are seeing here. I really wish it was a live session, but I mean one-to-one session, it's okay. This one, I presume everyone would think of an endometriosis over here. I would think that everyone would be thinking about a hemorrhagic cyst or something. Here is a simple unilocular cyst with no contents inside, so it's a simple cyst. Here, this is again a pattern of dermoid, where the dermoid cyst with no vascularity at all can have both hypoechoic and echogenic lesion. So we are dealing with an endometriotic cyst here, first image, second with a hemorrhagic corpus luteal, the last one the dermoid, and this one a simple unilocular cyst, probably physiological also. So why I want you to know the difference between the lesions, and why I put the common lesions first is because you need to differentiate between the benign and malignancy. The benign and malignancy is based on the IOTA classification. There is a separate IOTA group where all these are mentioned, so all these are available already. All what I want you to understand is, see it is a unilocular cyst. Even if it is less than 10 centimeters, if it's multilocular, it's okay. Where there is a solid particle which is less than 7 millimeter, with acoustic shadow and no blood flow. So all what I want you to remember is 10 centimeter lesion, even if it is unilocular or multilocular, if it is less than 10 centimeter, and a solid area less than 7 millimeter is okay. And those are features of benign. Malignancy, exactly the opposite. So we're going to see, these are typical examples of benign lesions. A simple unilocular lesion, a solid component, this is hardly a solid component less than 7, a multilocular lesion which still can be less than 10 centimeters, not much of vascularity, but it has acoustic shadow. Shadow, by what I mean, is an echogenic lesion and casting a shadow over here. All these could be a part of a dermoid. Wherein in malignancy, obviously you're going to have irregular solid lesion with increased vascularity. You could have your CA-125 levels increased, ascites, and excessive vascularity over the solid areas and no shadowing. So these are very typical with papillary projections. These are very typical of a malignant lesion. What will make our life very simple and easier is if you can download IOTA Adnex module or an app in your phone, or even when you see a patient. You don't have to remember anything of what I told you in the cyst. All what you have to do is measure the cyst, answer all these questions. The system or the Adnex model is going to ask you whether you have a CA-125 done. Is your center an oncology center? And along with those two questions, you just answer the other questions. This will prop up in your screen. When it pops up in your screen, you will know that the lesion, based on the data which you have entered over here, is going to be 95% benign, or how much is the risk of malignancy, 4.8, and what is the risk of a borderline tumor. So this makes our life very simple. All what you have to do is describe what you're seeing, measure it correctly, see what you're doing, see the vascularity, and plot it along with the CA-125 and the age of the woman. And we do, at least preoperatively, we could come to overall analysis as to whether it could be a benign or a malignant lesion, and you can plan for your frozen sections as well. Obviously, histopathology is going to be the gold standard. Definitely not saying no, but then this could definitely give us a clue before it. What I want you to see here is how we have applied this iota adnex module in these two cases and how we arrived at the diagnosis. A 21-year-old recently married, she had heaviness in the lower abdomen, otherwise she was perfectly fine, versus another woman who was completely sterilized and completed her family, on and off lower abdominal pain. She gives a history of a laparoscopic ovarian cystectomy done 2015, that is 3 to 5 years back. This is the first case, recently married girl, so was very hesitant for a transvaginal. So I told her, okay, we will do a transabdominal. The uterus was pushed in front. There's a complex mass lower down in the pouch of Douglas. So when we did a transvaginal ultrasound, you could see a large mass around almost 15 to 16 centimeters, multiseptated lesion. And you can actually see the right ovary over here on the side of the periphery. It was almost in the midline. This mass was multiseptated lesion, where this lesion, this uterus is a second case series which we thought that she had already completed her family and she had a prior history of an ovarian cystectomy done. Can you see? Probably this could be a recurrence in the case 2. So how do we report such cases, and how does iota adnex model help us to report? In the recently married girl, this is the second case scenario where she had a history of cystectomy done. We reported as complex multiseptated cystic lesion with obviously no solid areas, with minimal vascularity, and based on all the iota where we have entered the data, there is 96% chances of a benign lesion and only 3% chance of a malignancy. And obviously, and this when she was operated, it turned out to be a recurrence of a benign mucinous adenoma. So what I want you to understand is, when you follow the guidelines, the references, and the iota adnex module, it makes us little easier to differentiate between benign and malignant. It does make a lot of difference in counseling because it puts the patients and her relatives at ease. Pattern recognition is the key. You need to get familiarized with the pattern. Reporting model is very important because unless and until you report in a perfect pattern, you will not be able to arrive at the diagnosis. And recurrence risk and histopathology correlation obviously is going to play the major role in counseling the patient and her family. So moving on, yes, the last 5 minutes, what we are going to do is endometrial pathology. Endometrial pathology, one clinical practical point I want you to know is when you have fluid in the cavity, how do you measure the endometrial thickness? The endometrial thickness is measured like this when it is a normal triple line endometrium. When you have a fluid in the cavity, you need to measure the outer echogenic layer and the inner echogenic layer, surpass the fluid, do not include the fluid, and add these two. That's how you measure the endometrial thickness. The endometrial pathology, you know, the most common which we come across, this patient who came with post-menstrual spotting, almost for like 1 week to 10 days post-menstrual. We could find a single large lesion in the cavity with vascularity, and it was a feeder vessel, and obviously it was a single endometrial polyp and operated hysteroscopically. Another patient, very similar finding, she had severe pain and on and off irregular spotting, but her transvaginal ultrasound, can you see the difference between the uniformly echogenic lesion over here and the well circumscribed lesion in the cavity over here? When you put a 3D ultrasound, you can actually make across that this cavity, this is a cavitary solitary submucous fibroid, whereas that was a endometrial polyp. So this was also hysterolaparoscopically confirmed that it was a type 0 submucous fibroid lesion. So what I want you to remember in endometriotic lesion, in endometrial analysis, is that vascularity is extremely important. The endometrial cavity thickness should be measured in the right sense when it is echogenic, outer to outer. If there is fluid, include the echogenic part above and below the fluid and add them together. And make sure that you could differentiate between a polyp and a submucous fibroid. Not all the time it is easy. Definitely you can give a differential diagnosis. I'm not saying no, but you need to correlate your ultrasound findings with histolab so that you can, next time when you see a similar case, that you will be reporting it with more confidence when you have a correlation. That's very, very important. The last part of my talk is myometrial pathologies. This is more common than most of the things which we have dealt with. Fibroids and adenomyosis, we can never get enough of that, talking about it. It's a separate topic by itself. We had this mother, probably a couple of months, we had her thrice over the past 3 months. You can actually, she was actually came to us with your pregnancy positive, married recently for almost just 5 to 6 months. She was a young mother, and she came to us with UPT positive, and the referring gynecologist couldn't locate the sac. Transvaginal ultrasound was definitely not here. The TVS was not at all informative. First, we did a trans-abdominal ultrasound. We knew that there was a big lesion. We thought we will be able to catch the sac transvaginally. However, we were wrong. Transvaginally did not give us much information. Transabdominally, there was a huge fibroid, but where I could go more towards the right iliac fossa, we were able to see a small gestational sac. And she also came last week for her NT scan. The baby is growing well. This is a huge fibroid, almost around 16 to 15 centimeters. So how do we differentiate between a fibroid and an adenomyosis, where all of us are having this issue every day? So the most common thing what you need to do, both can coexist. Definitely yes. Fibroid is a well circumscribed lesion, where adenomyosis is going to be an overall enlargement with these Venetian blind things. This is what I say by a Venetian blind. So it has a rays of ultrasound, where in fibroid you can see they are well circumscribed lesion, where adenomyosis you cannot actually measure them per se. Yes, all of us, we know that there are phagocytating in fibroids. We are not going to talk about that. It's pattern recognition. The next time when you put an ultrasound probe or a transvaginal ultrasound, when you see a well circumscribed lesion, think more in favor of a fibroid. And when the entire uterus is enlarged homogeneously with rays, like sun rays, like pattern, then you will think about adenomyosis. Characteristic of fibroids are extremely important to differentiate between fibroids and adenomyosis. Phygostaging is important when you report. Only report with the phygostaging. That's when it helps the gynecologist to plan for a hysterol lab, and they can also make sure whether they need a resectoscope or not, and also for a Newton anomaly as well. Does it always seem to be easy to diagnose all this? Is it like, am I making it too simple? No, not at all. Once you have pattern recognition, and once you start doing large number of cases every day for a routine screening, start doing with normal cases, uterus and ovaries, start seeing normal corpus luteal cyst, then definitely we are going to improve on identifying our abnormal cyst as well. So these are the same images. I'm almost coming to the end of my talk, another couple of minutes. The same images which I put across in my first slide. I sincerely hope that we're able to identify what every lesion is now. So I'm going to tell you that. You can evaluate it for yourself. Yes, this is a corpus luteal cyst with peripheral vascularity. It's a unilocular cyst. All these images are taken only from my talk. So unilocular, probably a small solitary nodule, but it's a benign lesion. This is an adenomyotic uterus. This is a fibroid, and this is a complex lesion with more solid areas and might have vascularity too. So the interpretation of these images are very important. The next time when you go to the OPD and see, or when you see a report with a lesion, that you might be able to interpret them and correlate with the laparoscopic findings. So this is another tricky case where last two which I have put, I want to ask if free fluid is normal. It's a most very common question. Yes, free fluid minimal amount is normal, both during the reproductive age group. As you know, it could be a ruptured follicle or even a corpus luteal cyst, and even in a perimenopausal age group, minimal free fluid is common. So do not worry. Here you can actually see this uterus is enlarged all over. It's like uniformly enlarged. You can also see these raised pattern. If I assume that you can appreciate it. And there could also be a post-ovale adenomyoma. So this is an adenomyotic uterus and not a fibroid uterus. And this is more of a weighed mass, and it's not well circumscribed. So you put it across as adenomyosis rather than fibroid. I'm going to finish up with this last patient, very close to me, a staff nurse whom I know for many years. She actually went to a gynecologist, one of my very close friend, postmenopausal. She's very asymptomatic. She's a very thin, probably 40-45 kilos, and she directly went saying that there's some fullness in my lower abdomen. Otherwise, I'm perfectly fine. They didn't go for ultrasound. They directly went for a CT, and they did find an adnexal mass, but CT said there is a mass that needs to be evaluated. And next day morning, she came for an ultrasound, and we wanted to see what it was. Yes, the uterus, which we can see here, is a postmenopausal atrophic uterus. You can see a complex mass right adnexa with a lot of solid areas. Not a very good sign for me to counsel them. It took almost half an hour, 40 minutes to talk to them about the finding. She did her CA levels, which were CA 125 levels, which were raised twice as that of the normal. Then, with all heavy heart, we thought it's going to be malignancy because this is how we reported. And she also had ascites in the hepatorenal pouch and the Morrison's pouch. So, when we posted her for a frozen section, to our extent, we were so happy to know that even in spite of our analysis with postmenopausal, complex mass, a lot of solid areas, CA 125 raised, and to our surprise, and we were really happy to know that it was a benign lesion. So, according to the IOTA adnex module, when we put in everything, the lesion fell into 54%. That is like 50% of being benign and malignant. So, this is how your IOTA classification can still help you. And she actually fell into the other 50% category, which we were really happy about. And once again, thank you, folks. Thank you, Nithya, for inviting me. And I hope I was able to convey a few practical points. And the next time when you see patients or you see the scan reports, I think these small cyst patterns or the septate or biconvate uterus will be there in your mind. And yeah, can we go for
so thank you so much, ma'am. Actually, a lot of thanks actually coming in the, I think, chat section also. You can see in the question answer session also.
Okay.
So it was a quite interesting, and it was a very good response actually. In fact, at one point in time, we had 170 doctors.
Okay.
In fact, you covered up a day session in an hour's time actually. So as you said, ma'am, discussions would have been a little more productive. Probably in the upcoming sessions, we will plan like that. We'll plan as an interactive one. So there are a lot of questions, ma'am. I think you also can see at the bottom.
Yeah, can I open? Yeah. So we'll go for. Okay. Ovarian pregnancy, though rare, yes. Can you tell us how to differentiate from corpus luteal cyst apart from UPT? Yes, rares are rare. And before commenting on your ovarian pregnancy, you need to make sure a pregnancy is documented, if you're lucky enough, with a fetal pole, a sac, a yolk sac. So please do not over-diagnose things, because rarest things are always rare. Yes, I understand that this is the most common question that every one of us will want to know, how to differentiate an ovarian pregnancy versus a corpus luteal cyst. Everything is going to have an increased vascularity. If you can actually identify a hypoechoic lesion, a sac, an echogenic sac, or a hypoechoic sac within the echogenic lesion, lucky enough to have a yolk sac or a small fetal pole, go ahead and make a diagnosis as ovarian pregnancy. And the next one, what if it's an ovarian ectopic? Yeah, it's the same thing. Yes, interconval distance in uterine anomaly. Yes, the distance which between the two cavities, there has been two studies and two classifications, the Escher and ASRM, calling interconval or interosteal distance. There has been overlap, considerable overlap. There have been more than 10 to 12 papers about Escher classification, its pitfalls and the pros and cons of the same. So the interconval distance is between the two cavities, where you have two cavities. You can see the 3D rendering image which have drawn a line between the two cavities. So that's where you connect the two cavities with the imaginary line drawn after your 3D ultrasound. And the fundus, the midpoint of the fundus, there should be a perpendicular line drawn touching this imaginary line between the interconva. IOTA, no, IOTA Adnext model app is not paid. It's freely available. You don't have to even download the app. You can even just open it in your Google Chrome or in your Safari, and it's available. You just have to tap IOTA Adnext model, and whenever you have a case, you tap there, you feed in your data, and it will give you the model. You can see the malignancy and the benign risk ratio, and then incorporate it in your reports, so that at least it gives a ray of hope for the patients. Not that it's going to be 100% accurate, but then most of the time it is, because most of the time whatever we have done so far, differentiating between malignancy and benign, we've had most of the time correlating with the findings, even as in the last case which I showed you. What is the minimal amount of said to be normal? Okay, see, honestly speaking, it's going to be only subjective analysis. It's very difficult to say mild, moderate, severe in a fluid, unless and until we have a pocket of fluid or a fluid-filled pocket in a POD where you can actually collected fluid, where you can measure the fluid. Mild, moderate, and severe is definitely subjective. Yes, we do have criteria, we do have papers which say less than 30 ml, 50 ml, and more than 7500 ml is going to be a large amount of free fluid in the pouch of Douglas. Anything less than 30 ml is fine. 30 to 40 ml is definitely acceptable as normal. Okay, thank you. How to differentiate in terms of angle? Okay, see, the main reason why I didn't bring angle and measurement into criteria or diagnosis is because not everyone will have enough time to sit in the OPD to draw angles. So the most common criteria which Escher and ASRM has used is less than 1.5 centimeters, the fundal indentation, and if it is more than 1.5 centimeters from the line, perpendicular line drawn from the fundus to that of the interconval distance, then you can tell them that it could be a biconvate uterus. Yes, obtuse angle and acute angle are also differentiating features between septate and biconvate. Since I wanted to make it more practical oriented, I didn't go into a lot of numbers, because more numbers is going to be more confusing. And if you want to see most of them, or if you're a gynecologist, then if you have to see a report, I don't think you can draw in the report. So it's going to be more of a pattern recognition. And yes, definitely angles have to be measured. No doubt at all. Either you measure it in centimeters or you can measure it as angles also. Then, thank you. Yes, okay. We've had couple of cases of hypoplastic uterus or infantile uterus. We do not usually use the term infantile uterus. More so in reporting, we say hypoplastic uterus. There are probably, I can share an article with you where there is something called a golden ratio between the uterus and the cervix, and this golden ratio and the uterine measurement and the cervical measurement based on age group, starting from 6 to 7 years of age until menopause or post-menopause. Also, there are normal values. Probably I can share the article. And the normal uterine and cervical golden ratio is done before commenting whether the uterus is hypoplastic or not. And you take the length, width, and the breadth of the uterus, and also the ovaries before you call it whether it is ovarian volume is less or not. As I said, normal ovarian volume is normal from 2 to 10 cubic millimeter. Anything less than 2 in a reproductive in a reproductive age group could be diagnostic of reduced ovarian volume. But anything less than 6, on an average, you can have it in a reproductive age group. Less than 6 centimeter. This is for an approximate remembrance. I'm saying 6 to 6.5 centimeter uterine length measurement, or anywhere less than 3 to 3.5 centimeters of width or breadth measurement, you could suspect a uterine hypoplasia. But make sure that you plot it in the graph and measure the golden ratio and then report it. Advice where we can get IOTA Adnext module is freely available. You can just Google IOTA Adnext model. It is freely available and you can open it. Yes, cornual pregnancy. Yes, why I didn't specifically go to cornua and interstitial or angular pregnancy is that I didn't want to I really didn't want to confuse between all the things, and the time frame was very limited, so I didn't want to go to the rare case scenarios. We do have a couple of corneal pregnancies. What I can say is, when you are suspecting a corneal pregnancy, make sure that you identify the endometrial cavity completely separately. Like how I told you, you need to identify the ovarian margin separately from the ectopic pregnancy, right? The complex mass. Similarly, a complex mass with the sac inside and a cavity separately. Make sure that you identify, and it should not be covered all over the regions by myometrium. There should be 3/4 of myometrium, probably one end should not have myometrium involved, and then you can make a possible diagnosis of a corneal pregnancy. Yes, I will be sharing it. Endometrial thickness post second trimester abortion. Yes, endometrial thickness, see, there is no criteria cutoff. Say we usually depends from patient to patient. 10 to 15 millimeter is the routine in any reproductive age group, depending on what phase of menstrual cycle she is in. And if it is post-menstrual or post-abortal, yes, you could rule out retained products along with the serum beta HCG levels. That would also help. CA125 will increase in benign. Yes, it can. CA125 levels are extremely common to increase, not only in benign, it could increase in tuberculosis, it could increase in benign ovarian cystic lesions, it could increase in even colonic lesions. So CA125 are not really highly sensitive just for ovarian malignancies alone. Yes, definitely. I can share a sliding sign. Yes, we'll definitely record it. And yes, if this version is available, I'll definitely put it across as recorded video link. And I think I have completed the questions.
Yeah, ma'am. Yeah, ma'am.
Yeah.
So this is a recorded only, so we can actually share to
Yeah,
people
we can
also.
share it. Yeah, sure.
So on behalf of Foods and on behalf of the entire doctors, we thank you so much, ma'am. It is very much informative. So we would like to conduct future programs also like this association with you.
Thank you so much.
Probably we will make it as a discussion one in the future.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Foods. Thank you. Nice meeting all of you. Thank you so much for joining in. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.